She's not my blood. I walked her down the aisle out of pity. Jean Whitlock said it into the microphone at my wedding, smiling at the people who loved him for taking me in. I was still in my dress, bouquet in my hands, 180 guests watching. My mother didn't gasp. She smirked and lifted her champagne, like he'd finally said the family story out loud after 28 years of keeping it polite. For 1 second, the whole room waited to see if the bride would break. My name is Bess Whitlock. I'm 28. I didn't cry. I didn't reach for the microphone. I set my bouquet on the head table, crossed past the cake and string lights, and asked my maid of honor for the sealed envelope she'd guarded all night. Jean thought he'd just finished my story in front of everyone who mattered to him. But that envelope held the one thing in that room he couldn't control, and I'd been holding it all night. To understand what was inside it, and why a room full of people who had known me my whole life had no idea who I really was, you have to go back. Back before the dress, before the microphone. Back to a small town on the Mississippi, and to the 2 men everyone there called saints. Cape Girardeau smells like river silt and cut grass in June, and on the corner outside St. Anne's, where Jean shook hands after Mass, it smelled like him, drugstore cologne and certainty. He liked to stand there. He liked the way people slowed down to say his name. Jean, they'd say, gripping his hand in both of theirs. Good man. He'd wave it off with a smile that had been practiced somewhere private. I gave that girl everything, he told them, more than once, always loud enough that I'd hear it from a few feet away. Out of the goodness of my heart, the girl was me. Everyone knew the story before I could talk. My real father had walked out before I was born, didn't want me, didn't look back, and Jean had married my mother and taken in another man's child anyway. In a town this size, the pews at St. Anne's had assigned memories, and the whole parish had already decided which seat the Whitlock charity case belonged in. A few rows back. Grateful. Not every man would raise another man's mistake, a neighbor told me once, patting my arm like she was handing me a gift. I smiled. I was good at that smile. It didn't cost me anything anymore. The town made it official once, when I was in high school. The Rotary gave Jean a plaque at their spring dinner, Family Man of the Year, or something close to it, and I sat at a round table under a paper banner while a man at a podium described my stepfather's quiet sacrifice in raising a child who wasn't his own. People turned to look at me. I was the exhibit. Jean stood, thanked God and his own good heart in about that order, and rested his hand on my shoulder for the photo. I remember the weight of it. I remember clapping for the story of my own rescue. I was 28 by the time of the wedding, a hospice nurse at the county's only inpatient unit. I sat with people while they died. I learned to read a room the way you read a monitor. The small changes, the thing under the surface, the truth a body tells before a mouth admits it. I could tell when a family was lying to a dying man about how sick he was. I could not, to save my life, tell the truth about my own, because at home, money moved in a way I was never allowed to watch. Jean handled all of it. There was a drawer in his study that stayed locked, and on the first Saturday of every month he shut that door and sat in there alone for an hour. When I was small, I thought a job lived in that room. Nobody ever asked what he did in there. I tried once. I was 6, and I knocked on the study door on a first Saturday because I wanted him to come see a bird's nest in the yard. He opened it just wide enough to fill the gap with his body, so I couldn't see past him. But there was paper spread on the desk behind him and a checkbook lying open. "Not now," he said, and the door shut, soft, and I heard the little lock turn. My mother caught me in the hall and steered me back to the kitchen. "Your father is working," she said. Jean sold farm equipment for a living, and never once brought a lick of work home. I didn't have the words yet for how those two things refused to fit. Once I asked my mother a simple question, my father's name, his face, anything, and she set down her coffee very carefully. "We don't talk about him in this house," she said. That was the whole answer. That was always the whole answer. Then Aaron happened. Aaron Boyd, who fixed heating systems for a living and laughed with his whole chest and looked at me like I was easy to love. He noticed things. The first time he took me to dinner, I thanked the server 4 separate times, and afterward, in the car, he said gently, "You know you're allowed to just be there. Not everything you get is a favor." I didn't have an answer for that. I'd never once, in my life, felt like anything I got wasn't a favor. He proposed on the levee at dusk, and for the first time I let myself want something big and loud and public. I told my parents at Sunday dinner. My mother said we'd handle it properly, and Gene set down his fork, folded his hands, and volunteered before I could ask. "Of course I'll give you away," he said. "Who else would?" I let the good man give me away. In our town, saints were assigned. So was I. The story I was given came in pieces, and every piece had the same shape. I was maybe 5, sitting on the kitchen floor while my mother cooked, and I asked her where my daddy was. She didn't turn around from the stove. "He didn't want you, Bess." A pause, the spoon still moving. "I did. Gene did." Gene from the doorway, not even looking up from his paper. "Lucky for you." I learned early not to ask about him. There was no photograph anywhere in that house. Not in a drawer, not in a shoebox, not a single one. A whole man, erased down to a warning. And a warning is a strange house to grow up inside. You start to believe you are the kind of thing a person walks away from. You start to believe you were born already owing something you'll never be able to pay. School had a way of pressing on the bruise. In 3rd grade, our teacher assigned a family tree, little paper apples for each name. And I sat at the kitchen table that night, not knowing what to write in the space where a father goes. My mother glanced at it and told me to put Gene's name there and stop making it complicated. A boy in my class, whose mother knew the story, told me at recess that Gene wasn't my real dad, that I'd been taken in. I came home crying. Gene crouched down, wiped my face with his thumb, and told me I should thank God every night that somebody had been willing to take me at all. I said thank you. I was 7. I thanked him. That was the whole shape of it. Gratitude drilled in as manners. Every birthday was small and came with an invoice. I have one in particular I can still see. A grocery store cake with my name spelled slightly wrong, and Gene at the head of the table, counting out loud everything he'd given me. The roof, the shoes on my feet, the food, the mercy of it. He'd list them slowly and wait, and I'd say thank you in the right places, and my mother would nod along like we were saying grace. "You'd have had nothing without me," he'd tell me. "Remember that." I remembered it. One birthday, mid-list, he slipped. Considering what it cost me to keep, and then his jaw did something I didn't understand, and he stopped himself, and he started talking about the water heater instead. I didn't think about that sentence again for 18 years. By high school, I had stopped fighting any of it, and I want to be honest about what that looked like, because it's the part people don't understand about kids raised the way I was. I didn't rebel. I didn't slam doors. I got quiet, and I got useful. When a teacher asked me in front of the whole class what my parents did for a living, I said, my father sold farm equipment, because that was the answer that kept the peace. And I felt the small lie settle in my chest like a stone I'd already learned to carry. I was very good at keeping the peace. It's the only inheritance they ever actually handed me. There was one afternoon I did keep whole. I was around 10. I was digging through the drawer in Jean's study for a roll of tape, and I found a check instead. I couldn't tell you the exact number now, only that it was more money than I had ever seen attached to my family, and that my last name was written near it, and that there was a signature on the back I didn't recognize, in careful, old-fashioned handwriting. I was still holding it when Jean filled the doorway. He didn't yell. That was the part that scared me. He crossed the room, took it out of my hand, and slid the drawer shut with a soft, final click. "That's grown-up business," he said. "Forget you saw it." So I forgot it, exactly like he told me to. The number went blurry. The click did not. When I turned 18, there was the question of nursing school. I sat at that same kitchen table and asked, as carefully as I could, if there was anything, savings, help, anything at all. My mother reached over and squeezed my hand, which she almost never did. "There was never any money for you, honey." Jean nodded along without looking up. "You'll do what I did. Earn it." So I signed for it myself. $68,000, spread over 4 years, in a financial aid office with humming fluorescent lights and a cheap pen chained to the desk so no one could take it. I signed my own name to a debt at a table, alone, while a woman across the desk slid papers toward me one at a time. She asked kindly whether my parents could co-sign to bring the rate down. I said no before I'd even finished thinking it through, because asking Jean to put his name on my future would have cost me a lecture worth more than any interest rate. So I took the higher number and signed. I was 18, and I already understood the arithmetic of my own family. Help always arrived with a bill attached, and the bill was always steeper than just doing it alone. I packed a single duffel bag. I left. And on my way out the door, I turned around and thanked them. I paid my own way, and I thanked them for it. For years afterward, there was a payment that came out of my account on the same day every month, $68,000 shrinking one small bite at a time, and a resentment underneath it I didn't have language for yet. Much later, I'd learned that the whole time I was signing for that money, a fund with my name on it had been sitting a few miles away, full. They raised me on a debt I didn't owe. Every town has its good doctor. Ours was Doc Fenwick. Tom Fenwick had delivered half the county and treated the other half, and when he walked into an exam room, blood pressures came down just from the sight of him. His office had a smell I'd know blindfolded, cedar and orange, some balm he worked into his hands between patients, and he wrote everything with a fountain pen, because, he said, a man should be able to read his own promises. He'd been my doctor my whole childhood, and he was odd about me in a way I never questioned as a kid. When I was 13, I rolled my ankle running the 400 at a track meet, and it was Doc who taped it, right there in his office on a Saturday, gentle as anything, asking me about my times and whether I was sleeping and if I was happy. When my mother reached for her purse, he waved her off before she got it open. "No charge for you, Bess," he said, capping that pen. "Never any charge for you." He remembered my birthday when my own house turned it into a bill. He asked about my grades, my running, whether I was eating enough. I thought he was simply kind. I thought kindness was a thing certain men just had, the way some have height. He watched me grow up from a distance, and not once did I ask why the distance was there. It was only much later that I remembered the cedar and orange smell had a habit of turning up where it had no business being, at the edge of a gymnasium during a spring concert, in the back of an auditorium at an awards night, there, then gone, and me too young to place it or ask whose it was, because someone was always in the front row. At every recital, every concert, every graduation, there was a man down front who wasn't there for any child in particular. I have a clear memory of being 9, under the stage lights, forgetting the second verse of a song, my face going hot, the whole thing about to come apart. And I found one steady face in the front row, nodding at me, telling me without a word to just start again and keep going. So I did. And when I came down off the stage afterward to find him, he was already gone. There was only a seat, and the faint smell of cedar and orange where he'd been. He came to my high school graduation, too. I didn't spot him during the ceremony. You never do, with a whole gym full of families. But afterward, out in the parking lot in the crush of relatives and balloons, I caught that cedar and orange for half a second and turned around. There was Doc Fenwick, in a good jacket, standing off at the edge of all of it with his hands in his pockets. He nodded at me. I waved back, a little confused. The way you wave at a teacher, you're surprised to run into somewhere ordinary. Then a cousin pulled me one direction, and a friend pulled me the other, and when I looked again, he was gone. I remember thinking it was nice of the old doctor to come. I didn't think anything past that. Why would I? I never connected them. The doctor who forgot to charge me. The man in the front row who left before I could reach him. Why would a busy physician drive across town for the recital of a child who wasn't his? He died in October. A stroke. Fast. No warning. The kind of death he'd have wished on a patient, and the kind that leaves everyone else holding a sentence that never got finished. The whole town came. I came too. I stood at the back of the funeral home, near the door, because that is where the charity case stands, and I watched a line of people wait the better part of an hour just to lay a hand on his casket. I didn't go up. I stayed by the door and read the little program twice and listened to a priest call him a healer and a quiet, generous man. And I felt the strange, specific grief of mourning someone the whole town owned a piece of, and I only knew from a waiting room. I told myself that was all it was. A good man, gone. Nothing to do with me. I almost left before it ended. His nurse of 30 years found me by the door when it was over. Etta. She took both of my hands and held them a beat too long, her eyes wet, searching my face like she was waiting for me to give her permission to say something she wasn't allowed to say. "He'd have wanted you here, honey," she said. "In the front." I didn't understand it. I drove home, and for reasons I could not explain to myself, I could not stop thinking about the father I'd never had. That week I ordered one of those spit-in-a-tube ancestry kits, telling myself I only wanted to see the shape of the man who left. A country, a surname, something to finally aim all of it at. I mailed it the same week we buried a man I thought was a stranger. I buried a stranger. Then I mailed my blood to a lab. The results came back a few days after Christmas. I was on my couch, still in scrubs, half watching a show I wasn't following. My phone buzzed. The email said, my DNA matches were ready. I opened it expecting a long list of fourth cousins, small percentages, a country of origin, maybe one new surname I could learn to resent from a safe distance. At the very top, under a heading I had to read 3 separate times, it said, parent/child. A name sat beside it, Thomas R. Fenwick. I set the phone face down on my knee. Then I turned it back over, because I was certain I had misread it, and it said exactly the same thing. Parent, child. The man who supposedly didn't want me had a name, and I had known that name my entire life. I had let him not charge me for a sprained ankle. I had clapped for a plaque about the other man. I told myself it had to be a mistake, some database error, and I did what a person does. I dug into the match to disprove it. He'd sent his own sample to that same lab years back, chasing his own family tree, and it had been sitting there waiting the whole time. The shared DNA was not the amount you share with a cousin. It was the amount you share with a parent, and the site said so in plain letters. Lower on the list, to make it worse, sat a second Fenwick I'd never met, flagged as a paternal cousin, quietly confirming the whole thing. There was no version of the numbers that let him be a stranger. And then, sitting there on the couch, the memories began rearranging themselves without my permission. The cedar and orange at the edge of the gymnasium. The old doctor in the good jacket at my graduation, standing apart with his hands in his pockets. No charge for you, Bess. Never any charge for you. The steady face in the front row, telling a 9-year-old to just start the verse over. 28 years of small, unexplained kindnesses I had quietly filed under a good man being good. And every one of them clicked into a new place at once, like tumblers falling in a lock, and spelled a word I had never once allowed myself to read. Father. Here's the part I don't have clean words for, so I'll just tell you what my body did. The room went quiet, in a way rooms don't. My hands were suddenly very cold. I looked down and realized I was still holding the little cardstock program from his funeral. It had been riding around in my scrub pocket for 2 months, and I had never once noticed it, and I could not for the life of me remember picking it up off that table. His name was printed across the front in soft gray. Thomas Fenwick. Beloved. I had stood at the back of my own father's funeral, near the door, because I believed I didn't belong any closer. I missed him by 8 weeks. That's when it broke. Not loud. Nothing like you'd imagine. I pressed my hand flat over my mouth and held it there, hard, like I could keep the sound inside if I just pressed hard enough. And I stayed like that on the couch until the room stopped tilting. Then I made myself breathe. Once. All the way in. Somewhere in the next hours, I lost track of time. I know I ended up in my car. I know I drove past his shuttered office on Broadway and sat at the curb across from it with the engine running, looking at the dark windows of a waiting room that used to smell like cedar and orange, like the one place in town that never sent me a bill. The dashboard clock said 2 in the morning before I understood I'd been sitting there long enough to be cold. I didn't remember most of the drive. There were things I would never get to ask him. What his voice sounded like across a dinner table. Whether he'd have walked me down an aisle if they had let him, and what he might have whispered on the way. Whether he ever sat in that dark office and thought about knocking on our door and just saying it out loud. Every one of those questions had an expiration date, and I had blown past it by 8 weeks. Because underneath the grief, a colder question had already begun to form, and it was exactly the kind of question a hospice nurse knows how to follow to the end. If Tom Fenwick was my father, if he had been right here in this town, in the front row, for 28 years, then he had never walked out on anyone. The man who left before I was born did not exist. There had never been a deadbeat. There had only ever been a story, told to a small girl at a kitchen counter, again and again, until she grew up certain she was something to be ashamed of, which meant someone had kept my father away from me, on purpose, for my whole life. I sat with that a long time. Not the grief, the fact of it. Someone had built the deadbeat out of nothing and handed him to me at a kitchen counter before I could spell my own name, and then kept building him, year after year, birthday after birthday, until I was certain in my bones that I was the kind of thing a man walks away from. That is not neglect. That is construction. It takes effort. It takes 2 people deciding, over and over again, to keep a small girl believing the worst possible story about herself. And I was going to find out exactly how they had done it. I was still at that curb when my phone lit up. A text. From a number I'd saved at the funeral without knowing why. It was Etta. I have something he left for you, it said, when you're ready. Etta's kitchen smelled like coffee and old paper, and she had it on the table before I even sat down. A plain envelope, soft at the corners from being handled, and a fountain pen laid across it like a paperweight. I knew the pen. I had watched it cap and uncap over 100 childhood earaches. He asked me to hold these until you were happy, Etta said. She nudged them an inch toward me across the table. He said you'd get married one day, and I was to wait for that before I gave them to you. You look happy this year, Bess. So I think it's time. My fingers shook when I touched the pen. It was the first thing of my father's I had ever held. I didn't trust my voice, so I didn't use it. Etta watched me a moment, then said the thing that turned grief into something with an edge. Before you read his letter, honey, you should see where your money went. My money. I didn't have money. I had a loan payment that came out on the 15th. I asked her what she meant. Etta only shook her head and folded her hands on the table. It's not my place to explain it, she said. He kept the letter with me because he trusted me. He kept the rest of it out in the open, on paper, because he wanted it to be findable one day. Some men leave you money, honey. Your father left you a trail. She walked me to the door and held it, and just before I stepped out into the cold, she said, quiet, he'd be glad it's you asking, and not me telling. I called Junie that night. Junie is my oldest friend, and she's a clerk at the courthouse, which means she knows exactly how to find the paper a family leaves behind when it's sure no one will ever look. It took her 3 days. She pulled deeds and filings and account histories on her lunch breaks, and she texted me updates the whole time, each one landing heavier than the last. A filing here, an account history there, photocopies she'd had to pull a favor to get. By the time she came to my apartment on the 4th day, she wasn't smiling the way Junie usually smiles. She set a thick folder on my kitchen table, squared it against the edge, and put one finger flat on the first page. She told me she'd rather I hear all of it from a friend across a table than find it alone at midnight on a screen. This was set up when you were 3, she said quietly, in your name. It was a trust, an irrevocable trust, funded by Tom Fenwick, with my mother named as trustee, the person legally bound to spend every dollar of it on me. The early pages were almost tender. Deposits, regular as a heartbeat, $1,250 a month from a man who wasn't allowed to hand it to me himself, so he sent it into a fund and trusted her to carry it the rest of the way. At its height, the account held a little over $300,000. There had always been money. For me. I stared at that number until it stopped reading as a number. $300,000, sitting in an account with my name on it, while an 18-year-old me signed $68,000 in loans under a pen chained to a desk so no one could steal it. Keep going, Junie said, and turned the page. The next pages were where the tenderness ended. Withdrawal after withdrawal, year after year, each one logged in the flat, bloodless language of a bank. Trustee disbursement. Household. Trustee disbursement. Household. A new truck the year I was 12. A kitchen remodel. 2 weeks somewhere with a beach. The summer I was working doubles at a nursing home to make rent. The balance sliding down and down like a fever breaking the wrong way, all the way to the last statement, dated the spring before Doc died. $2,800. That was everything left of me. They spent my father on themselves. I must have made some sound, because Junie came around the table and sat down beside me. She turned to the withdrawals and went very still. Bess, she said slowly, every dollar that came out of here went out on a check. She put her finger on the back of one, on a signature endorsing the money into a personal account. Look who signed for them. I already knew whose handwriting it would be. I had watched it slide a drawer shut when I was 10 years old. Junie stayed until the numbers stopped swimming in front of me. Before she left, she asked what I wanted to do. I didn't answer right away. I looked at the folder. the deposits in my father's careful hand, the withdrawals in the bank's flat print, the endorsements in Jean's, and I felt something in me go very still and very clear, the way it goes at a bedside when there's finally nothing left to do but tell the truth. "I want to see a lawyer," I said, "and I want to read his letter." So there it was. A fund opened when I was 3, with my name on it, emptied by the 2 people who swore to my face there was never any money, while the man who filled it sat a few miles away and watched me sign for loans. If you were sitting at that table, holding that folder, with the man the whole town called a saint standing between you and the truth, what would you do with it? Would you burn it quietly and keep the peace? Or would you make them look? Tell me below. And if you already suspect which man in this story actually loved me, comment 2 words. Front row. You'll understand by the end. I couldn't open his letter that night. I read the bank statements twice instead, because numbers were safe and his handwriting was not. It took me 2 more days before I could sit down at my kitchen table with the envelope and the pen and let my father talk to me for the first time in my life. The paper still smelled, very faintly, of cedar and orange. I'm going to give it to you the way he wrote it, because it isn't mine to shorten. Bess, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you found your way to the truth without me, which is exactly how brave I always knew you'd be. I want to say it plainly once, the way I was never allowed to say it out loud. I am your father. I have been your father every single day of your life. I was at the spring recital when you were 9 and lost the second verse and started over anyway. I was 3 seats from the aisle at your graduation, and I left before you came down, so that no one would ask why the old doctor was crying at a stranger's ceremony. I stood close enough to hear them call your name. That was all they ever let me have. I never walked away from you, sweetheart. I was made to stand at a distance and call it kindness. There were people who told me that if I ever tried to close that distance, if I ever claimed you out loud, they would take you from me twice. Once from my arms the day you were born, and once from the little I was still allowed. So I did the only thing a coward with a good heart can do. I paid. I watched. I saved you a seat, every time, in the only row they would let me have. There is money that was always meant to be yours. If it's gone, then someone took it, and I think you already know who. Make them look at it, Bess. Not for revenge. I never wanted that for you. For the record. So that no one in that town can ever call you the charity again. I'm sorry I was quiet. I'm sorry it cost you so much to find me. And I am so proud of you. It aches. Love, Dad. He signed it. Dad. Once. The only time he was ever allowed to. I read it on the floor of my apartment with my back against the couch, and somewhere in the middle my hands stopped working well enough to hold the page flat, so I laid it on the carpet and read the rest bent over it like a woman reading a headstone. I didn't sob. I just couldn't make the next breath come for a while. His absence had never been his choice. That was the whole weight of it, right there on the carpet. Every empty chair I had ever blamed him for had had him in it. 3 seats over, silent, watching me the only way they let him. I went back to Etta with one question. Who told him they'd take me twice? She folded a dish towel very slowly before she answered, smoothing it out flat on the counter like it mattered. Your mother, Etta said. She came to him before you were born. She told him that if he ever admitted you were his, she'd take it all down with her. His marriage, his practice, his name in this town. And he believed her. He was probably right to believe her. She looked at me. So he chose the front row. He decided a piece of you was better than the scandal that would have cost him all of you. Blackmail. My mother had turned my father into a ghost and charged him rent for the haunting. And Jean had endorsed the withdrawals. Jean had known exactly whose money was buying his trucks and his beaches. The saint who took in another man's child had been paid to do it, kept the difference, and stood over that child at every birthday telling her what she owed. There was one more door I had to knock on before I understood the whole of it, and it was the hardest, because the woman behind it had done nothing wrong. Nancy Fenwick had been married to my father for 30 years and never had a child of her own. I sat in her front room and told her, as gently as I have ever told anyone anything, that her husband had a daughter, and that the daughter was me. I watched it land. She didn't come apart, but something behind her face did. The private arithmetic of a 30-year marriage rearranging itself in a single afternoon. She pressed her lips together and looked down at her hands for a long time. "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't hurt," she finally said, her voice steady and thin. "But—" She stopped. She got up, crossed to a roll-top desk in the corner, and opened a small drawer. She took out a photograph, held it a second, and handed it to me. It was my school picture. 4th grade. Gap teeth. A haircut I'd like to forget. "He kept this in his desk," Nancy said. "Every year a new one appeared, and I never asked how, and now I know why." Her hand trembled as she passed it over. "His widow learned it the same week you did, it seems." I didn't know what to say to her. So I said thank you, and I meant it for a great deal more than the photograph. At the door, she stopped me. "There's a will, Bess. Your name is in it." She held my eyes, and her voice didn't waver. "And I won't be the one to fight it." Junie brought me the paper trail. 25 years of it, photocopied and stacked on my table like a deck of cards that had only ever dealt one hand. One stack had built the fund up. My father's careful fountain pen hand, $1,250. The memo line left blank because there was no safe word for what the money was. A deposit into the trust every month, regular as a heartbeat, for 25 years. The other stack had torn it back down. Withdrawal after withdrawal, and on the back of everyone, endorsing my money out of the fund and into a personal account. The same signature over and over and over. Jean's hand, the exact loop of the G I had watched slide a drawer shut when I was 10. "Same signature," Junie said, sliding them across to me one by one. "On every dollar that left. For 25 years. His theft was written on the back of every withdrawal. The bank stamps told the rest of it. The money never stayed in the fund my father built for me. It was pulled out and made Jean's almost as fast as it came in, month after month, for a quarter of a century. I laid a few of them out on the table by year. My father's $1,250 arriving the month I turned 10, and the withdrawal that carried it right back out. His deposit the semester I took a second job to cover a textbook I couldn't afford, and the check that emptied it again. The money coming in faithfully every month of my life. The same signature turning it away from me just as faithfully. I had spent that whole year of double shifts believing there was nothing. There had been this. There had always been this. I took all of it to an estate attorney, a plain-spoken man named Walt Brennan, who had handled Fenwick family business for 2 decades and did not rattle easily. He read for a long time without saying anything, turning pages, laying photocopies side by side across his desk in little rows. Then he set his glasses down and told me the truth I hadn't wanted to hear. "Your father named you in his will," Walt said. "That part is clean. But the estate's already in probate, and once it distributes and closes, clawing your share back out means years in court." He tapped the calendar on the wall behind him. "The window to lock your claim in is closing. You've got weeks, not months. We file now before the estate settles, or you spend the next decade proving what you can prove today with one folder." I asked about the trust, the $300,000, the drained account. Walt didn't flinch. That's a different fight, he said. Breach of trust. Conversion. Civil and slower. And that clock only started the day you found out, so it can wait. This one can't. I asked him about the DNA test, whether that was the thing that would prove I was Tom Fenwick's daughter. Walt shook his head, not unkindly. A store-bought test won't decide paternity in a courtroom, he said. But you don't need it to. Your father named you in that will himself, by name, in his own hand. The test isn't your evidence, Bess. It's your certainty. It's the thing that means nobody in that town ever gets to call you a liar or a grave robber again. He tapped the will, then nodded at the DNA. This is what wins. That is what shuts them up. He slid a single document across the desk toward me and set his pen on top of it. This one's a matter of weeks. I signed it. I want to be honest about what I decided in that office, because it matters to the rest of this. I did not decide to blow up my own wedding. I decided to let a courtroom do the quiet, permanent work, put my claim on the record, attach the will, the DNA, the letter, all of it, before anyone could move a dollar or spin a single story. Walt filed the petition on a Tuesday, but by then Jean could feel it coming. He'd caught wind of a courthouse clerk pulling old family records, and he was not a stupid man. My mother had noticed me going quiet in a new way, a way I'd never gone quiet before. She called me twice that week, fishing, asking, too casually, whether I'd been digging into old things and whether it was really worth upsetting the family right before the wedding. I told her I was just busy with the seating chart. She didn't believe me. I could hear it. Jean tried a different way. He showed up at my apartment 2 days before the wedding, unannounced, with a bottle of wine as a congratulations, and he stood in my doorway a beat too long, his eyes drifting past me to the table where I'd been working. Big week, he said. No sense stirring anything up now. Some things are better left in the ground. He was smiling when he said it. He meant the dead man. I told him I appreciated the wine, and I'd see him Saturday, and I did not let him pass the door. So I did one more thing. I gave Junie a duplicate of everything. The DNA, the trust statements, the checks, a copy of the filed petition, and a copy of the letter, sealed in a plain envelope. I'm not going to make a scene, I told her, but hold on to these, in case he does. I wasn't planning a scene. I was ready for his. So when Jean reached for that microphone at my reception, Junie already had the envelope in her lap. The morning of June 6 smelled like hairspray and peonies, and Jean Whitlock knocked on the door of the bridal suite in a rented tux, holding out his arm to me like a present. An hour before that, Junie had zipped me into the dress and set the beaded clutch on the vanity between us, and neither of us said much about what was folded inside it. She fixed a pin that had come loose in my hair. She squeezed my shoulder once. Whatever today turns into, she said, you don't owe anybody a performance. I looked at myself in the mirror. The veil, the borrowed earrings, the face that had smiled through a rotary plaque and 100 birthdays of thank yous, and I made myself a small, quiet promise. Whatever else this day became, it would be the last one I ever spent being grateful for a lie. I took it. I let him have the aisle. Understand what that cost. I knew everything by then, every dollar, every signature. My father's voice folded into the clutch a few feet away, and I still walked the length of St. Anne's on the arm of the man who had stolen from me, smiling, because reversing it that morning would have started a war before my ammunition was safely on the record. Let him have the aisle, I told myself. The courthouse already has the rest. We came up the aisle of the same church my father had once sat in the front of. Uninvited, unclaimed, 3 seats from where I was now walking. I passed the front pew on the way up. I don't know what made me look at it. Just an empty stretch of polished wood, roped off with a white ribbon for the family. But I looked, and for 1 second I let myself picture him there, in a good jacket, hands in his pockets, come to watch a ceremony he was never allowed to be named in. Then Jean's arm tightened on mine, steering me forward, and the picture was gone, and I kept walking. Aaron was waiting at the altar, and when he caught my eye, he mouthed the same thing he'd said in the car all those months ago. Not everything you get is a favor. It steadied me more than he could have known. We said our vows under a stained glass window I'd grown up beneath. And for a few minutes, the whole rotten history of that building went quiet. And it was just the two of us, and a promise I actually believed in. Then we crossed the street to the reception hall. String lights strung corner to corner. A 3-tier cake. 180 people who had watched me grow up as the girl somebody had been generous enough to take in. Somewhere near the front, at a table just off the head table, Junie sat with a small beaded clutch on her lap, and she caught my eye and pressed her hand flat against it. It hasn't left my hand since sunrise, she'd told me that morning, and it hadn't. For a while, it was the wedding I'd wanted. People danced. My mother worked the room in a blue dress, accepting compliments on the day like she'd planned every inch of it herself, and Jean held court at a center table, telling the story of walking me down the aisle to anyone who'd sit still long enough to hear it. I watched him from across the floor and felt the old familiar pull, to go smooth things over, to keep the peace, to make sure the good man was comfortable. I didn't move. I let him have his table. I knew what was in the clutch, and I knew it wasn't going anywhere. And there's a strange calm in watching a man enjoy the last hour of a story he thinks he owns. Dinner went fine. The toasts started. Aaron's brother, then Junie, warm and funny, raising a glass to a friendship 2 decades deep, and Jean, who had been working through the good bourbon and glowing under the attention all night, got to his feet and asked the DJ for the microphone to say a few words about the bride. I should have known. He could never let a room look at me too long without reminding it whose mercy I was standing on. He tapped the microphone twice. He smiled out at every face that had ever called him a good man. "She's not my blood," Jean said. I walked her down the aisle out of pity. The room made a sound like a held breath. He wasn't finished. "Now, I've loved this girl like she was my own. But I think folks ought to know, before she gets too comfortable up here, that our Bess spent that old doctor's last months cozying up to him, and she's been circling his estate ever since he passed. Now she's after what he left behind." He shook his head, sorrowful, generous even with the knife in his hand. Manipulated a sick man. Right there at the end. It's a shame to say it, but blood is blood, and she was never really ours. I looked at my mother. She was smiling. She lifted her champagne toward him, a small private toast, the way you salute someone who has finally, after 28 careful years, said the family story properly out loud. 180 people waited for me to cry. I could feel every eye in the room slide toward me and stop. Aaron had gone still at my side, and I felt his hand find the small of my back, ready to stand up and fight this for me, because that is who he is. I laid my hand over his, just once to tell him I had it. Somewhere a fork clinked against a plate, and then went quiet. Like even that had thought better of the moment. I didn't cry. I reached out and set my bouquet down on the head table, right beside the cake. I crossed the floor, past the string lights, in no hurry at all, heels slow and even on the wood, the whole room silent enough to hear them. I have sat with dozens of people in the last hour of their lives, and they teach you something about time, that it slows down when it matters most, that you can do the most important thing you will ever do without rushing it. I did not rush. I let them watch me cross the entire floor. I stopped at Junie's table and held out my hand. The envelope, Junie. She placed it in my palm. As I turned back toward the room, the flap gaped open an inch, and I saw the corner of the page on top. A court stamp, red ink, a single word. Filed. I walked back to the front of that room, envelope in hand, and faced the man who thought he had just finished my story in front of everyone he knew. "Whatever you say next, Jean," I said, quiet enough that 180 people had to lean in to catch it. "It's already filed. The court has a copy." Then I opened it, and I said the name none of them expected me to know. My father's name was Tom Fenwick. The room didn't gasp. It simply stopped. 180 people going still at the same instant, forks down, the music dying mid-song as somebody found the switch. I lifted the first page. "Here's the proof." I read them the line. "Parent, child, Thomas R. Fenwick," my name beside his. Jean laughed. "It came out wrong, pitched too high." "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, opening his arms to the room. "She's got some story about a dead man cooked up so she can grab at his money. There's no—" A few people near his table nodded along, because that was the version they'd been fed for 28 years, and it was comfortable to keep believing. But most of the room had gone quiet in a different way. The way a room goes quiet when it senses the comfortable version is about to stop being available. I didn't argue with him. I didn't raise my voice. Arguing was his game, not mine. I just reached into the envelope again. I set the DNA down and lifted the next pages. A trust, opened in my name the year I turned 3, funded by Tom Fenwick, $1,250 every month, for a daughter he was never allowed to claim in the open. I held the statements up beside it, the balance at its height and the balance at the end. $300,000, down to $2,800. I let the two numbers sit next to each other in the air. 300,000. 2,800. I told the room, evenly, that the difference had paid for a truck, a kitchen remodel, a beach vacation the summer I was working doubles to make rent. I watched a few faces do the arithmetic. I watched the woman in the blue dress stop smiling. Then I set the statements down. "And these," I said. I lifted the checks. 25 years of my father building that fund up, his handwriting on the front of every deposit, and 25 years of it being drained back out, one signature on the back of every withdrawal, again and again and again. "You told this whole town you gave me everything out of the goodness of your heart." I looked straight at him, and for the first time all night I let the room hear the cold underneath my voice. "This is your heart, Jean." Signed. Every month. For 25 years. From a table near the back, Nancy Fenwick rose to her feet. "That is his pen," she said, and her voice carried clean across the frozen hall. "And that is his handwriting on the front of every deposit. I would know it anywhere." Jean's face was going gray at the edges. "That money was for the household, for raising her. That's not a crime, It sat in a trust with my name on it," I said, "and you signed for every dollar that ever left it. The bank stamped every single one." Nancy was still on her feet at the back of the room. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at Jean, at the endorsements, at 25 years of her late husband's money sitting in another man's account. And whatever grief she had carried in that morning was hardening into something else entirely. Nobody at Jean's table was nodding now. Then I held up the last page. The red one. "This was filed with the probate court on Tuesday. My claim, my father's will, all of it." I let it sit in the silence. "It's been on the